Hello, dear listeners. Gather around and make yourselves comfortable. For tonight, I have a story that will send chills down your spine. It's a tale of unexplained dreams, lingering guilt, and a haunting that challenges the boundaries between the living and the dead. Our story takes place in the 1990s, in a quaint, unassuming town where supernatural tales often whispered through the air. Despite the local legends, I never believed in such things. That is until I moved into a newly built neighborhood and experienced something that made me reconsider. It all started innocently enough. Each night I found myself trapped in the same unsettling dream. A shadowy figure called my name from a distance, his silhouette barely visible in the murky darkness. Though I couldn't see his face, there was a haunting familiarity about him. The harder I tried to make out his features, the more blurred he became. Every night, the dream tormented me, disrupting my sleep and slowly chipping away at my sanity. At first, I brushed it off as stress from the move or simply adjusting to a new environment. But the dreams grew more intense, and my waking hours were filled with a creeping dread. One morning, as I waited for the bus to work, something inexplicable happened. Without realizing it, I wandered into the middle of the road, oblivious to the oncoming traffic. A kind-hearted woman pulled me back just in time, saving me from what could have been a fatal accident. The onlookers murmured in confusion, wondering what had possessed me to step into danger so blindly. Desperate for relief, I visited a friend who ran a small clinic and obtained some sleeping pills, hoping they would bring me the rest I so desperately needed. Ignoring the prescribed dosage, I doubled it, longing for a night of uninterrupted sleep. As the medication took hold, I felt a drowsiness wash over me like a heavy fog, and soon I was fast asleep. But the nightmare returned, more vivid than ever. The shadowy figure, now closer, called my name with increasing urgency. This time, I could almost see his face. He drew nearer, and the familiarity became undeniable. It was someone I knew, but my mind refused to connect the dots. In the dream, my body moved on its own, following him despite my mental resistance. He led me to a grove of trees, a place I recognized but couldn't place. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. Then I saw it. A massive tree that triggered a flood of memories. This was the execution ground, where convicted criminals were sent to meet their end. The figure turned to face me, and his identity was revealed. It was Jack, a childhood friend who had been executed for murder 2 years earlier. His face twisted in anger and betrayal. He demanded to know why I hadn't visited him. His voice grew louder, more accusatory, and blood began to seep from a wound on his forehead. The terror jolted me awake, my heart racing. The dream had felt so real, and I couldn't shake the lingering fear. Memories of Jack came rushing back. How we were inseparable as kids. How we'd promised to stay friends forever. Life had pulled us apart, and his tragic end had left me with a sense of unfulfilled obligation. Determined to lay these spirits to rest, I called our mutual friend Mark, who had also been haunted by dreams of Jack. Together, we decided to visit Jack's grave, hoping it would bring closure. Finding his neglected resting place took longer than expected, but we finally stood before his overgrown tombstone. With heavy hearts, Mark and I cleared away the weeds and spoke to Jack, sharing our regrets and memories. We apologized for not keeping our promise and promised to honor his memory. From that day forward, the nightmares ceased. Occasionally, Jack would appear in my dreams, but no longer as a vengeful spirit. Instead, he was the smiling friend from our childhood, and I felt a sense of peace. And so, dear listeners, remember this. Sometimes the past reaches out to us in ways we can't ignore. If you ever find yourself haunted by unresolved guilt or unfinished business, perhaps it's a sign to confront it, to find peace for both the living and the departed. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this chilling tale. Sweet dreams, and may your nights be free of shadows calling your name. Until next time, dear listeners, take care and keep the light on. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a chilling tale of suspense and mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Tonight, I'm going to share a spine-tingling story about an ordinary fishing trip that turned into a haunting experience. So, settle in and get ready for a journey into the unknown. Meet Jack, a regular guy living in a quiet town near a large river. Jack didn't have many hobbies, but he loved fishing. Every morning, he would grab his gear and head to the riverbank, hoping to catch something big. One crisp autumn morning, Jack and his friend Tom decided to take a stroll by the river for their usual morning exercise. As they walked, Tom suddenly spotted a massive fish lurking in the shallow waters near the reeds. "Jack, come look at this!" he called out. Jack rushed over and saw the fish, its dark, glistening body moving sluggishly as if inviting them to catch it. Jack was stunned. This fish had to be at least 3 feet long, a giant by any standards, especially for this quiet river. His excitement was palpable. He raced back home, grabbed his fishing rod, and returned to the spot. He cast his line and waited. Hours passed, and all he managed to catch were a few small fish. Just as he was about to give up, the float on his line suddenly dipped deep into the water. Jack's heart raced as he struggled with the heavy pull on his rod. After a few intense minutes, he reeled in the huge black fish. Jack was ecstatic. He rushed home to show his wife, Mary. "Look at this beauty," he exclaimed. "This one's for dinner." Mary was impressed, but wary. She remembered an old saying, "Fish over 2 feet long have a spirit. They should be released." But Jack laughed it off, insisting that it was just a superstition. Mary reluctantly prepared the fish, cooking it into a large stew. As they sat down for lunch, Jack eagerly took a big bite. Instantly, his face twisted in disgust. The fish tasted foul, like rotten meat. He spat it out, horrified. Mary, confused, tried a piece herself and found it just as revolting. Disappointed, they decided to throw the whole dish away. That night, as they tried to sleep, Jack heard a soft, eerie sound. A woman crying. The sound was faint, drifting in and out, coming from outside their bedroom. At first, he thought it might be the neighbors, but as he listened, he realized the sound was coming from within their own house. Nervously, he got up to investigate. He walked through the dark, silent living room and found nothing unusual. But then he heard it again, louder this time, coming from the kitchen. With a growing sense of dread, he opened the kitchen door. To his horror, he saw a ghostly figure of a woman standing over the trash can where they had thrown the fish. Her hair was wild, her skin decayed, and blood-red tears streamed down her face. She turned and lunged at him. Jack screamed and fell back, covering his face. He felt a cold grip on his arm, shaking him violently. Suddenly, he woke up to find Mary standing over him, worried. "Jack, are you okay?" she asked. He was drenched in sweat and trembling. He told her about the apparition, but she dismissed it as a bad dream. The next day, Jack was bedridden with a high fever. Tom came to visit and heard the whole story. He mentioned an old legend that he had heard as a child. It said that if a fish eats from a corpse, it grows unnaturally large. And if that person died with a grudge, their spirit haunts the fish, trying to lure people to their doom. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the legend was true. A month later, an old fisherman cast his net near the same spot where Jack caught the giant fish. He pulled up a skeletal corpse, long decayed yet unmistakably human. The police were called, and it was revealed to be a victim of an unsolved murder. Jack was haunted by the thought that he had caught the ghost of the river, a restless spirit seeking revenge. The old fisherman received accolades for solving a mystery, but Jack knew he would never fish in that river again. And that, dear listeners, is the terrifying tale of Jack and the ghostly fish. A story that reminds us that sometimes legends hold more truth than we care to admit. Thank you for joining me tonight. Remember, not everything that glitters is gold, and not every big catch is worth the risk. Stay safe, and until next time, good night. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our story hour, where the lines between the known and the unknown blur into an unsettling, chilling tale. Tonight's story is not for the faint-hearted, so gather around as I take you on a journey into the eerie and the mysterious. Remember, if you've lived a life of integrity, you have nothing to fear when the clock strikes midnight. It was the 1990s in a small, quaint town known as Meadowbrook. Life here was simple and peaceful, but even the most serene places can harbor the darkest secrets. Our story revolves around a boy named John and his grandmother, Mrs. Anderson. One day, Mrs. Anderson took John to the local clinic for a checkup. On their way back, they ran into Mrs. Thompson, a fellow member of the local dance troupe. They exchanged pleasantries and misses. Thompson invited Mrs. Anderson to join the dance practice that evening. But Mrs. Anderson declined, as John was ill and needed her care. As they neared their apartment building, they noticed a man approaching from the opposite direction. Mrs. Anderson recognized him as a new tenant who had recently moved in. He was known around the neighborhood for his lack of employment, which unfortunately marked him with a certain stigma. John began to act strangely, his eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Anderson, concerned, asked, "John, what's the matter? Why are you staring at me?" John, trembling, whispered, "Grandma, there's an old man in a costume following you, just like the ones we see on TV. It's really scary." Mrs. Anderson turned to look, but saw no one behind the man. She reassured John, "There's no one there, dear. You must be imagining things." Feeling a bit uneasy, but dismissing it as a child's overactive imagination, she took John home. However, John insisted, "Grandma, I'm not lying. There was someone there." 10 days passed, and John had fully recovered. One evening, Mrs. Anderson decided to join Mrs. Thompson for a dance session, taking advantage of a rare moment of leisure. The two women left their building, chatting and laughing. As they walked past an apartment, a putrid smell hit them, like that of a decaying animal. Mrs. Thompson stopped, covering her nose, and asked, "Do you smell that? It's awful." Mrs. Anderson nodded. "Yes, it's coming from that apartment. The tenant is rather untidy, probably just garbage piling up." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't convinced. "It smells more like something dead," she said, worry creasing her brow. They decided to report it to Mr. Collins, the neighborhood watchman. Mr. Collins arrived, sniffed the air, and agreed something was amiss. He knocked on the door, but there was no response. The gap under the door was stuffed with advertisements, indicating no one had been home for days. Sensing something was wrong, he called the local police. The police arrived swiftly. After consulting with the landlord, they decided to enter the apartment. As they opened the door, they were met with a stench so overpowering that it made them gag. Inside, the apartment was in shambles, and in the center of the living room lay a corpse, clearly dead for several days. The body was that of the new tenant. His face was frozen in a grotesque expression of terror, eyes and mouth wide open. The officers quickly sealed off the area and called in the detectives. The scene was chaotic, with signs of a struggle everywhere. The detectives examining the scene felt a cold presence behind them, but when they turned, there was nothing there. Later, Mr. Collins recounted the discovery. "The place was a mess, and it seemed like the man had been scared to death," he explained. The cause of death was determined to be a sudden heart attack, likely triggered by extreme fear. Further investigation uncovered recently excavated artifacts, revealing that the man was a grave robber who had met a fitting end for his deeds. When Mrs. Anderson shared John's earlier sighting of the ghostly figure with the neighbors, few believed her. However, she was certain that her grandson had seen something real, something that had come to claim justice. And so, the story of John and his grandmother reminds us that some wrongs invite more than just earthly consequences. Here in Meadowbrook, a town seemingly untouched by time, the past can reach out with cold, spectral hands. Thank you for joining me tonight. Remember, live your life with a clear conscience, and you'll have nothing to fear when night falls. Until next time, sleep well, if you can. Welcome, dear listeners, to a tale that will send shivers down your spine and leave you questioning the thin veil between this world and the next. Tonight, I recount an eerie event from my childhood, one that I witnessed with my own eyes. Prepare yourselves for a story of ghostly happenings, unfulfilled desires, and the mysterious ways of the afterlife. Let us begin. In a quiet village nestled somewhere in the west, an old woman named Mrs. Smith passed away unexpectedly. Her family arranged for a proper funeral and hired a group of strong men to carry her coffin to its final resting place. But as they lifted it, the coffin became impossibly heavy, as if it had turned to stone. 6 burly men strained and struggled, but it wouldn't budge. The police had a term for such incidents. They called it ghostly intervention. I was just a child then, around 10 years old, living in the front yard of Mrs. Smith's house. On the day she died, my mother and I were on our way to help out with the preparations. Along the way, we ran into old Mrs. Johnson, who was deep in conversation with my mom about Mrs. Smith's untimely death. They whispered about how she had lost her way, trying to deliver something to her daughter, who lived far away. Mrs. Smith had been battling what we now know as Alzheimer's disease, a cruel condition that robs people of their memories and sense of direction. Her daughter Lily had married and moved south, seldom visiting. That fateful day, Mrs. Smith packed a bag of corn and set out, saying she was going to visit Lily. My uncle, Mr. Brown, knew of her condition and usually kept an eye on her, believing she would soon return on her own as always, but this time it was different. Within an hour, Mr. Lee, a villager, came rushing in, shouting that something terrible had happened. Uncle Brown sprinted out with him to the edge of the village, where they found Mrs. Smith lying lifeless on the ground. She had fallen and never gotten up. With a heavy heart, Uncle Brown carried her back home and started making arrangements for the funeral, sending a message to Lily, hoping she would come back in time. In our village, we had a tradition of watching over the dead for 3 days before burial. Mr. Thompson, the village elder, reminded Uncle Brown of this custom, but Uncle Brown was anxious. Mrs. Smith had died with her eyes open, a sign of unfinished business. She had wanted to see her daughter one last time. Despite Mr. Thompson's best efforts, her eyes wouldn't close. It was clear to everyone that Mrs. Smith's spirit was restless, yearning for her daughter. As the days passed, the tension grew. Uncle Brown pleaded for more time, but Mr. Thompson warned that the burial must happen before the 7th day, lest her spirit cause trouble. By the 6th day, there was still no sign of Lily. Fear of what might happen on the 7th day pushed Uncle Brown to agree to the burial. 4 strong men hoisted the coffin, but as they stepped out of the village, disaster struck. The coffin crashed to the ground with a loud thud, sending everyone into a panic. According to tradition, once a coffin is lifted, it must not touch the ground until it reaches the grave. This omen terrified Mr. Thompson. As everyone stood bewildered, a sudden gust of wind howled through the village. Mr. Thompson rushed to the coffin bearers, urging them to lift it quickly. But try as they might, the coffin felt immovable. It was as if an unseen force held it down. Uncle Brown noticed that the coffin had fallen at the exact spot where Mrs. Smith had died. He suggested that perhaps she wasn't ready to leave, still hoping to see Lily. More men were called to help, but even with 6 people, the coffin remained stubbornly grounded. With no options left, Uncle Brown tried speaking to Mrs. Smith's spirit, promising that Lily would visit her grave as soon as she arrived. They tried lifting the coffin again, but it was no use. Everyone was at a loss. Just then, Uncle Brown's son pointed toward the village entrance. There, amidst the dust and wind, was Lily, hurrying home. Exhausted and teary-eyed, she rushed to her mother's coffin, apologizing for her late arrival. Overcome with grief, she collapsed onto the coffin, sobbing. Seeing her daughter, Mrs. Smith's eyes finally closed, a single tear rolling down her cheek. The crowd watched in awe as the heavy coffin suddenly became light enough to lift. With a deep breath, Mr. Thompson gave the command, "Lift the coffin!" This time it rose effortlessly. The burial went smoothly after that. Lily stayed behind, mourning and honoring her mother's memory for 3 months, visiting her grave daily. I watched her from a distance, carrying flowers and talking softly to the grave. I believe Mrs. Smith found peace knowing her daughter had finally come. And so, dear listeners, the tale concludes. A mother's love, undeterred by death, waited for one last moment with her child. It's a chilling reminder of the bonds that tie us, even beyond the grave. Thank you for joining me tonight. May this story stay with you, a whisper in the dark, reminding you of the mysteries that linger just out of sight. Good night, and remember to cherish those you hold dear, for you never know when the final farewell might come. Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of mystery and suspense. Sit back, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown, where the lines between reality and the supernatural blur. This is a story passed down through generations, filled with chilling encounters and eerie revelations. So, dim the lights and prepare to be captivated by this haunting narrative. Many years ago, before modern conveniences reshaped our world, there lived a humble farmer named John in a small rural village in the countryside. John toiled endlessly on his land, his weathered hands a testament to a life of hard work. Each evening, after a long day of labor, he would return home, light a fire, and pour himself a modest drink, savoring the solace it brought. One fateful night, as John sat by the flickering flames, he noticed a small creature perched on the woodpile near his fireplace. It was a weasel, its eyes gleaming with hunger. John, feeling a rare moment of compassion, tossed a piece of his own meager meal toward the creature. The weasel, wary at first, eventually approached, sniffed the offering, and devoured it. From that night on, the weasel became a regular visitor. John, finding an odd sense of companionship in the creature, began to talk to it as if it could understand. "Ah, if only you were a person, we could share our troubles and joys," he mused one night, his words slurred by the alcohol. John's life was fraught with hardship. He was in love with a local girl, but her family demanded a dowry he could not afford. Night after night, he confided in the weasel, pouring out his heart. "If only I had the money, I could marry her," he lamented. The weasel watched him silently, its presence a strange comfort. One particularly gloomy night, as John drowned his sorrows in drink, he heard a voice. "I can help you," it whispered. Startled, John looked around but saw no one. The voice spoke again, and to his shock, it came from the weasel. "You need money. I know where you can find it." John, half convinced he was dreaming, listened as the weasel explained. "In the hills to the west, there's an old tomb. Inside, you'll find more than enough to pay your dowry. But beware, take only what you need. Too much greed can bring disaster." Desperate and hopeful, John decided to follow the weasel's advice. That very night, under the cover of darkness, he made his way to the old tomb. As he dug through the earth, his heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. Soon, he uncovered a grand coffin, adorned with intricate designs. Inside, he found an array of treasures, but heeding the weasel's warning, he took only a string of pearls, enough to secure his future. As John was about to leave, a sudden temptation gripped him. "Why not take more, eh?" he thought. He reached back into the coffin, grabbing a handful of jewels. Just then, he heard a noise behind him. Turning around, he saw 3 figures, thieves, drawn by the rumors of hidden wealth. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" one of them demanded. John, terrified, tried to flee, but it was too late. The thieves set upon him, beating him mercilessly. They took everything he had, leaving him broken and penniless in the dirt. John's dreams were shattered. The next morning, he limped back to his village, empty-handed and heartbroken. The girl he loved was married off to another, and John was left alone, his hopes dashed. Years passed, and John eventually married a kind woman who accepted him despite his poverty. They had children, and though life was hard, they found joy in the simple things. But John never forgot that night. He often wondered what might have been if he had resisted his greed. The weasel never returned, leaving John to ponder whether it had ever truly existed. Some say it was a spirit testing him, offering a chance at a better life. But John had failed the test, and the consequences were his to bear. And so, dear friends, let this tale be a lesson to us all. In our moments of desperation, we may be tempted by easy solutions, but we must remember the dangers of greed. True happiness comes not from wealth, but from the simple, honest life we build with our own hands. Thank you for joining me in this journey into the unknown. Until next time, remember to cherish the small blessings in life and beware of the temptations that lurk in the shadows.